Welcome, Farmers Branch family. We are broadcasting live tonight from the city of Duncan, Oklahoma, from our makeshift studio here in the Hampton Inn. Lindley Hope Nicole Riley has joined us in the world today. Well, she was in the world, but outside of her mom. She's joined us today, and that's why we're here celebrating grandbaby number 5. Great times here. But we also have some somber issues facing us here at Farmers Branch Church of God. Sister Gregory is still quite ill and in the hospital. When I understand, she is improving somewhat, but it's kind of a roller coaster up and down ride. Keep Brother Gregory and Sister Gregory in your prayers, intensively in your prayers. And there are others. Rick is still very sick from what I understand, although I haven't gotten any good, more recent information. And keep him intensively in your prayers, and all the others that are ill among us. And hold them up before that throne. But tonight we have exciting things to do. We are beginning on the amazing prophecy of Daniel. Did you know that many scholars, and if you look at some references, it'll say the consensus among scholars is that Daniel never lived, or that he lived, but he didn't write the book of Daniel because it is so uncannily accurate about the events that it describes. It's as if someone already knows the history and is writing a prophecy for the known history. However, recent events have blown that completely out of the water since the finding and dating of 8 copies of the prophet Daniel from almost 300 years before Christ in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And finding that many copies has only been recorded in keeping with books that the Essenes, the author, the scribes of those scrolls, found extremely important and canonical. So here we have the book of Daniel pre-existing completely by carbon dating and by other methods the events that it describes, making it a prophecy in no uncertain terms. And also with the high regard that these scribes held the book in, it doesn't speak to a work whose author is not also held in high esteem. And so you'll still read that stuff. You'll read, if you go to Wikipedia, if you go to preface of many commentaries, you'll find that they still disseminate that nonsense. Nobody wants Daniel to be true. And least of all do Jewish scholars want Daniel to be authentic and true, because he prophesies so very many things that make them uncomfortable. Daniel's book will begin with a court chronicle that mainly traces the events surrounding Daniel and his 3 friends that we know mainly by their Babylonian given names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, also called the 3 Hebrew children. Now they have Hebrew names, but they need to be disambiguated from other people in the Bible by the same names. And so it's really a handy way to do that by using their given Babylonian names. It talks about their exploits and how God protects them in their time under the rule of the Babylonian and the Persian kings. But even in that portion of Scripture, there is some apocalyptic content, because Daniel is given the ability to know the content of and interpret the meaning of dreams. And those dreams have prophetic and apocalyptic character to them. But then we also see the visions of Daniel that are clearly apocalyptic, in which he sees the future of his people. And that future includes the rise of the king of Greece, the fall of Babylon at the hands of the Medes and the Persians, the rise of the Greek king Alexander the Great, and subsequently the kings that followed him, primarily those that affect the land of Judea, the Ptolemies and the Seleucid kingdom, which struggle against each other for control of Judea. And it tells the history of that period of time in exacting detail. It also foretells the evil king Antiochus Epiphanes, which we've discussed in our study of Maccabees. And we see much of the history detail that Daniel prophesies detailed in the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And that's why I went through much of 1st Maccabees, and why I suggested very strongly that you read 1st and 2nd Maccabees, because then you will see Daniel's prophecy played out exactly as the history relates it. An amazing prophecy. But we'll also see he prophesies beyond that. Some scholars say that's all he prophesies. He prophesies up through that time and the events of the Maccabean revolt. But we find that there are two abominations of desolation, one of which certainly was the unholy act of Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, when he overlaid the altar of God with the altar of Zeus Olympus. That was certainly an abomination that resulted in the destruction and the desolation of the temple. But Jesus says, as a future event to his disciples, when you see that abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. So this was an event that was in Jesus' future, while the Maccabean revolt and Antiochus Epiphanes was all in Jesus' past. So here we see he's talking about two abominations, and we see that Daniel's amazing prophecy also speaks of a future prince of Israel, a future Nazi of Israel, two future rulers of Israel, one an anointed and the other a son of destruction, and one that represents an abomination that results in the desolation of not just the temple, but the temple and the land. And we know him as Bar Kokhba, and he's the worthless shepherd of Zechariah, and he's also here in Daniel. So Daniel's prophecy is the entirety of the history of Daniel's people, beginning with the time of the ending of their captivity, which is soon at hand, as we'll find out, all the way to the end of the nation in 135 AD. That's the period of time that Daniel's prophecy will cover, and will cover in amazing detail. Now, what Daniel does not cover in detail specifically is our future. However, there are some things we can know about our future by the paradigm that Daniel sets forth. And so we'll discuss that at the end of the book in our study of it. But what we'll find out is that Daniel is told what period of time he will prophesy about. He prophesies about that period of time with exactness and precision by writing down the words that God gives him. It's an amazing prophecy. So we can go ahead and get into the text. Well, a little more background first. First of all, Daniel and his three friends are royalty. They are sons, as in nephews, grandsons, etc., of Hezekiah. And as nobility, it was promised that they would become eunuchs. And certainly that prophecy was fulfilled by the Babylonians. And it was because of their status as desirable young men and as intelligent young men, as well as those who had been castrated, which had special significance in the ancient world, and people that were entrusted, especially with harems and with rulers' wives, but also with other things. They felt that they were more trustworthy if they were absent of testicles. Anyway, Daniel, there is information that leads me to believe, and it's both scriptural and rabbinical, that was likely the case with Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children, sadly. However, it did not put them at a disadvantage when ruling and when governing, and allowed them to assume positions very quickly as trusted advisors and stewards that they may not have even been considered for, being foreigners and being in a situation that people of that time felt them to be less trustworthy. And so the time of this is at that the writing begins is at the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. And so we'll begin reading with Daniel 1:1. And I'll read from the NIV. And then when we get to certain portions, I'll read variously from texts of the Septuagint, as well as alternative Septuagint texts, as well as other versions of the King James Bible, the ESV, etc. Because there are some passages that are really very difficult, and I think have been obfuscated over the years, because among the things that Daniel prophesies is the time of the coming of the Messiah. And it was fulfilled just like he said. But there are some people that don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And for them, it's a very problematic portion of Scripture. In fact, there's a rabbinical curse placed on those who would use Daniel's 9th chapter to figure out when the Messiah would come. And the reason that's so problematic is because it lands squarely on Jesus. So, Daniel 1:1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. And these he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, or in Hebrew it's Shinar, and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, king of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve the king in his palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Now, the interesting thing about these names, Daniel, he gave the name Belteshazzar. That's a funny name. All these names are funny in Chaldean, in Babylonian. They're funny names because the name Belshazzar is pretty straightforward. It means Bel, the god of Babylon, protects. Belteshazzar, it's unclear what that means, and there are some people that believe it means that the te means does not. Bel does not protect. And that would be a funny name to be given from the beginning, but we see Nebuchadnezzar at one point say, I've given you a name after the name of my God, at a point where his God has been proven inferior and has not protected him, where Daniel's God has. And so I think that that does support some people's opinion that it means Bel the god of Babylon does not protect. And then Hananiah gets the name Shadrach, then Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. And all of these things, all of these names are similar to Babylonian names, but seem to have been altered in some slight regard to lose their meaning toward various deities of Babylon. That their names were meant, that the names that these are familiar to honor the gods of Babylon, but these names are not really found anywhere else in the Babylonian record. And I wonder if not only did they beg off of the king's food, but they may have actually begged off of his names as well and asked for them to be changed ever so slightly, perhaps to avoid honoring the gods of Babylon. That's an interesting thought. Verse 8, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who's assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Now, this is not to mean that being a vegetarian or avoiding total abstinence from wine are somehow healthier ways to eat. That's not what this is saying. This is saying on a minimalist diet with water and just vegetables, the nutritional content of which is much lower than meat, that God protected them miraculously because of their faithfulness and not willing to be ceremonially defiled because of unclean food and drink. It's not indicting meat and preferring vegetarianism, and it's not preferring teetotalism over the moderate use of wine. It is, that's not the point here. Now, one can perhaps make an argument for those things from other directions, but that's not what it's meant here. God is taking care of these 4 young men. And to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. So we see the first test of their faith, God has brought them through it and has miraculously provided them, not just miraculously provided them physical health, but has miraculously provided them wisdom and supernatural abilities, not only to interpret dreams, but to know the content of the dream without being told, as we'll see in the subsequent chapter. So in chapter 2, in the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Then the astrologers answered the king, Well, may the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we'll interpret it. The king replied to the astrologers, This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you'll receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. Once more they replied, Well, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we'll interpret it. The king answered, I'm certain that you're trying to gain time because you realize that this is what I've firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there's only one penalty for you. You've conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. The astrologers answered the king, There's no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans. Yet. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, Why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time, so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness and dwells within him and dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we ask of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, Don't execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dreams for him. So here Daniel is not only saving himself and his three friends, he's asking for mercy for all the wise men of Babylon. Now, I don't know if there's a sermon there or not. The preachers among us will have to decide that, but it sure sounds like that can preach somehow. Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means. And the king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, Are you able to tell me what I saw in the dream and interpret it? Daniel replied, No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he's asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you were lying in bed are these. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mystery showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. Your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. And while you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue, became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. It was the dream. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. Your majesty, you are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky. Wherever they live, he's made you ruler over all of them. You are that head of gold. So here Daniel is equating the features of his dream with nations, beginning with Babylon, the head of gold. After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. Next, as silver is inferior to gold, the next level of silver. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze. Now, bronze is less valuable than silver. So we're beginning to see the majesty of these kingdoms and the splendor of these kingdoms diminish with time. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom, yet will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. Now here we've got described kingdoms of descending splendor, gold to silver to bronze to iron mixed with clay. And in these, we don't really have a lot of symbolism attached to the appendages or to the number of digits or other features of the statue, but just to the metals of which they are made. I know when you get down to the toes and all that, people have made much of 10 toes, 10 nations, the common market. In my lifetime, I've seen the common market grow to 10 and then to 32, then to 36. And so I don't know of too many statues. There was not a statue here with 36 toes, is there? Well, but we do see the character of these kingdoms displayed in the type of substance or mixture of substances that they are made out of. And so we're going to get an interpretation of this. Before I give you what might sound like David's interpretation, let's give you God's interpretation. In the times of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Now here is talking about all of the kingdoms of earth that precede a certain period of time. It's not talking about all of the nations on earth until the end of the world. That would be a much taller statue with much more numbers of layers. He's talking about the kingdoms that would lead up to the rock, and the kingdom being handed over to this rock, not hewn with human hands. You remember in our study of Revelation, in the 12th chapter, with the events that describe the coming of Christ in the flesh, the incarnation. It says prior to the incarnation that the kingdom of this world is become the kingdom of our God and its Christ, and his Christ. Now that's when the kingdom is handed over to the rock. And from there, the rock grows into a great mountain and is the all in all. And other nations have no significance whatsoever in comparison with Christ's kingdom. And what we'll see these same nations spoken of, with not in the metaphor of metal in a statue, but we will see them spoken of as metaphor of beasts from the sea. And we'll see that metaphor repeated in the Revelation in the 13th chapter, and again in the 17th chapter, where they have grown up from their juvenile forms. But we'll see a metaphor for these same nations. And they're Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And then that Roman Confederation that's so tenuously and loosely bound together that is crushed by the rock. And this not only describes these nations, it also describes the nation of Judea, the Jews, under the domination of each of these empires. But people like to go on and on and on about the significance of how many toes and try to, in keeping with C.I. Scofield and with others, strange interpretations of these scriptures where they take a part of Daniel and they move it to the end of what they call human history, to the end of the world. There's certainly an end time spoken of by Daniel. And it is that end time that was 135 AD, that end time for the people of Daniel. And we may well be approaching yet another end time, an end of the time of the Gentiles. But that's not what Daniel's talking about. And it doesn't concern Daniel, because we'll find later that he will prophesy up until the Messiah and the judgment and desolation of those that reject him. So then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed, now they're called by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. I think we've got enough to chew on tonight to wait on the third chapter until next week. I hope everyone has a good week, and do not forget to pray for those who suffer among us. Good night.